Hello interwebs, I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk about something really awesome, the recent Time magazine cover story about transgender star Elliot Page, and I want to use that to talk about a few other harder things that resonated with me personally about that article and that cover story. Specifically about Elliot speaking about how hard it was for him to come out as transgender as his acting career began to grow at a very young age, and kind of connect that to how many transgender folks and LGBTQ folks in general generally constantly have to think about how we frame, represent, or hide our LGBTQ identity in order to create a more consumable or palatable presentation for others in order for us to survive. I was slowly rotating as I was saying all of that because I was this is a rotating chair, and I was just sort of sitting in my chair with my feet up, and so I just slowly started drifting this way. Tokyo Drift, yeah. Whee! I'm drifting. Okay, now that I'm done being a dork, for those of you who haven't been on the internet or Twitter in the past few months, which, honestly, good on you. Elliot Page, the actor known for things like Juno, Inception, and the Umbrella Academy, recently came out as transgender in December 2020, and Time magazine made him their first ever trans man to be featured on their cover, which is something that's incredibly awesome not only for transgender visibility, but specifically for trans masculine representation. While certainly transgender visibility and understanding has come a long way in terms of public, oh my gosh, I cannot speak today. Can I ever really speak ever though? Anyways, has come a long way in terms of public consciousness over the past few years. It's mainly been focused on trans women and trans feminine folks, and often when trans men or even non-binary folks get mentioned, it's more of an aside, or they're sort of lumped in with the larger transgender community without any real focus on issues that are specific to trans men or non-binary people, such as for trans men, because we're going to be kind of focusing on that for this conversation, their specific medical needs, access to top surgery, for example, or things like the infantilization of trans men in general in our culture. So for Elliot to really be centered in this way as a trans man and to really be celebrated and talked about is honestly really awesome, and I want to applaud him as well as Time magazine, but specifically him for not only gifting himself this ability to come out and share more of who he is with himself and with the world, but also gifting us with a chance to know him better. And not only that, but using his Time magazine story to really center not only himself, but trans men and a ton of other transgender issues facing our community. So that's honestly just really, really awesome, and I just think that that's just so cool, and I really hope that this is a really cool tipping point for the trans masculine community. I think that's just wonderful, and Elliot Page is honestly a true hero of not only mine, but of I'm sure many trans people in the community, trans men or not, or the LGBTQ community in general, because he's just truly awesome. But all that's really just one piece of this that I wanted to touch upon briefly in this video, and one more thing that I wanted to touch upon kind of briefly here is I really think that it's worth highlighting how this Time magazine article written by reporter Katie Steinmetz is honestly really, really good. I mean, I reread Caitlyn Jenner's Vanity Fair cover story from 2015, which was only 6 years ago, for this video, and rereading that article, which was one of the first sort of big cover stories about a trans person, and comparing that to how Elliot Page's article was written, you can already see this sort of vast gulf in how we talk about transgender issues just comparing these two stories. The writer of Caitlyn Jenner's coming out constantly misgendered Caitlyn throughout, referred to her by her dead name, focused constantly on the glamour of her coming out, and also hyper-focused on the grisly specifics of her surgeries throughout the decades. All stuff that many of us know today can be hurtful or dehumanizing or stigmatizing for just trans people in general, and sort of leans into stereotypes, not just for Caitlyn Jenner, but for trans people in general. But not only does Steinmetz in the Time article never dead name or misgender Elliot, she keeps the focus of the story on Elliot's emotional journey and only really mentions surgery when it's germane to the discussion and the story of his life, and she never really goes into the specific details of Elliot's surgeries. And even more amazingly though, Steinmetz smartly used Elliot's emotional story more as a springboard to talk a lot about other major issues going on for trans people today, such as the horrible rate of murder of trans women of color that's going on in the United States and around the world, the current rise of legislation to try to ban transgender folks from sports, which I talked about in a recent video, and my aforementioned issue that I talked about the lack of major visibility for trans men. So I honestly want to take a moment to really also praise Katie Steinmetz, because this is just a really, really well written article and a really well done piece, especially for a major publication. Like, I'm not used to seeing this level of care from this sort of widely circulated outlet when it comes to trans issues. So just praise where praise is due. But for the rest of this video, I don't want to go through the entire article piece by piece. I highly recommend that you check it out, though, so I'll have the link below. But while I've spoken about a lot of issues that the article touched upon before in other videos, there was one element of Elliot's story that really resonated with me as I read it that I haven't spoken about a ton on this channel, about how for many LGBTQ folks, we are often forced to hide our identities because to represent ourselves authentically would mean potentially ruining our careers. But I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from the article here. But he does remember the acute feeling of triumph when, around age 9, he was finally allowed to cut his hair short. I felt like a boy, Page says. I wanted to be a boy. I would ask my mom if I could be one someday. Growing up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Page visualized himself as a boy in imaginary games, freed from the discomfort of how other people saw him, as a girl. After the haircut, strangers finally started perceiving him the way he saw himself, and it felt both right and exciting. The joy was short-lived. Months later, Page got his first break, landing a part as a daughter in a Canadian mining family in the TV movie Pit Pony. He wore a wig for the film, and when Pit Pony became a TV show, he grew his hair out again. I became a professional actor at the age of 10, Page says, and pursuing that passion came with a difficult compromise. Of course, I had to look a certain way. That role in Pit Pony led to other productions and eventually, when Page was 16, to a film called Mouth to Mouth. Playing a young anarchist, Page had a chance to cut his hair again. This time, he shaved it off completely. The kids at his high school teased him, but in photos he has posted from that time on social media, he looks at ease. Page's head was still shaved when he mailed in an audition tape for the 2005 thriller Hard Candy. The people in charge of casting asked him to audition again in a wig. Soon, the hair was back. So this part of Elliot's story really resonated with me personally in a few different ways. For one, like Elliot and many transgender folks, I knew that I felt like another gender other than the one I was assigned at birth. And in my case, I was assigned boy at birth. And I kind of knew that I felt different, maybe not necessarily as a girl, though I kind of knew it was girl, when I was really, really young. And similarly, I too visualized myself as a girl in imaginary games like Elliot did for him imagining himself being a boy. I remember I would bet girls in my after-school daycare program to games of tag that if I lost the games of tags, I would have to be forced to put on a dress for a little bit. And of course you would assume that I let myself lose a lot of the times, like, oh no, I have to wear a dress for the next 15 minutes. This is so awful. And I got made fun of, and there was a lot of like sort of jokes, but inside internally I felt really awesome. I felt amazing. And it was just nice to have these like brief moments of getting to be my true self and letting others see my true self, even if it was couched in sort of like irony and jokes, much like how Elliot details in another segment of the Time article that when he shaved his head for a role, he felt at ease within himself, even though his fellow classmates would make fun of him for having a more masculine looking head. Like, his comrades saw him for him, even though they didn't realize it. And so for Elliot, even though it was couched in jokes and sort of irony, it was a chance for him to actually express himself. And that just like really resonated with me in just that small piece of his story. And this is a very common experience for many trans folks, not all trans folks, but many trans folks, that we have these extremely memorable but tiny moments throughout our lives where we get to experience these precious bits where we are able to express ourselves in the way we would like. It's often like really, really small, like for me wearing a dress in daycare, or for Elliot cutting his hair short for a short amount of time. They're just small things ultimately, yet you cling to them because they feel like they're moments of the real you shining through the performance of you that you're putting up in every other aspect of your life. Because that's what everything else is, in a way, a performance. And that brings me to what Elliot also started to speak about, because in the article, he talks about how he started to get acting roles at a young age. And because he was seen by others as a girl and was viewed in sort of that way, he was cast in female roles. And his career started to become dependent on him being viewed by filmmakers, sold by his agents, and consumed by the public as a girl. Now, because of this, Elliot became a very public-facing figure as a prominent actor who skyrocketed to stardom at a young age. I mean, people knew Elliot as a girl, saw him as a girl, and honestly, when you're at that kind of level, you start to cultivate this brand as a public figure. And doing anything to change that could possibly ruin your career and your ability to pay your bills. There's this misconception today that coming out is almost always a boon to people's careers, but that can be the case in some way, shapes, or forms, but it's not always. And even that ability to have coming out be a sort of boon to your career is an extremely, extremely recent development. And it's not just coming out as trans either. There have been numerous other careers of LGBTQ folks who had their careers really, really hurt just by coming out as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, sort of a sexuality coming out as opposed to a gender coming out. Lance Bass of NSYNC, for example, talks about how his career as a male sex symbol was hurt after he came out as gay. He wasn't seen by people who wanted to hire him or continue his career as consumable to his mostly female audience. And so a lot of his, I just bit my tongue as I said that, ow. Yeah, that's why I'm not a singer. Ooh, ow, that really hurt, actually. But that did hurt his career. Another singer, for example, country star Chelsea Wright, the sales of her album were cut almost in half after she came out. Even people today who we think of as big representatives of the LGBTQ community, whose careers skyrocketed and are sort of defined by them being LGBTQ, like Ellen DeGeneres, had their careers hurt when they first came out. For example, like I said, Ellen DeGeneres, when she came out, it was seen as this sort of landmark moment for LGBTQ visibility. But even then, her show was canceled 1 year after she came out on it. And then it took several years, and I think over a decade, and a huge cultural shift in general around LGBTQ acceptance for her to finally see her career reemerge. For better or worse on that one, given her own recent controversies. And even these examples are fairly recent in terms of pop culture memory. These people are still around and doing stuff today. We can see through that how important this consumability of your brand as a straight or cis person is still considered to be a huge deal for public pop culture figures. You can even go back further in Hollywood history to a time when Hollywood would literally force LGBTQ stars to marry each other in what is known as Lavender Marriages. One of the first of these, and one that's sort of a speculative one, but it goes all the way back to 1919, where silent film actor and sex symbol Rudolph Valentino was married to the rumored lesbian Jean Acker. And that's, like I said, sexuality, something that will certainly change how people view you as a person in a public arena, especially if you're a sex symbol, for example. But ultimately, it doesn't change what kind of roles you can play or work you can get or your ability to sing in any way. But kind of take that and think about what it means to come out as transgender in a visual medium like film, which for some trans people like Elliot means that one would want to change how they express themselves visually in their new gender, and that'll affect what roles they get offered, and not only that, but what they look like or how they're gendered within those stories of the roles that they get accepted, or just how people just wouldn't want to get involved with them in their work of art due to the stigma of hiring a trans actor on their production. Especially if an actor is typecast in a large way that they're seen in specific types of roles. So there's a very real risk to someone's career. And it forced Elliot to feel that he had to hide who he was in order to make himself more consumable to the public, in order to hold on to his career. And this had vast mental health effects for him, as the article points out. Page's tour de force performance in Hard Candy led, 2 years later, to Juno, a low-budget indie film that brought Page Oscar, BAFTA, and Golden Globe nominations and sudden mega fame. The actor, then 21, struggled with the stresses of that ascension. The endless primping, red carpets, and magazine spreads were all agonizing reminders of the disconnect between how the world saw Page and who he knew himself to be. I just never recognized myself, Page says. For a long time, I could not even look at a photo of myself. It was difficult to watch the movies, too, especially ones in which he played more feminine roles. Page loved making movies, but he also felt alienated by Hollywood and its standards. Aaliyah Shawkat, a close friend and co-star in 2009's Whip It, describes all the attention from Juno as scarring. He had a really hard time with the press and expectations, Shawkat says. Put this on, and look this way, and this is sexy. By the time he appeared in blockbusters like X-Men: The Last Stand and Inception, Page was suffering from depression, anxiety, and panic attacks. He didn't know, he says, how to explain to people that even though I was an actor, just putting on a t-shirt cut for a woman would make me so unwell. Shawkat recalls Page's struggles with clothes. I'd be like, hey, look at all these nice outfits you're getting, and he would say, it's not me, it feels like a costume, she says. Page tried to convince himself that he was fine, that someone who was fortunate enough to have made it shouldn't have complaints. But he felt exhausted by the work required to just exist, and thought more than once about quitting acting. For Elliot, he suffered deeply because he had to hide who he was. And it became for him this battle between existing and living a life worth living. To work required him to just exist, and he never got to actually live. But that's the catch-22 that he was placed in. If he came out, he might lose his entire career and his ability to do what he loves with his craft and to pay his bills. The stakes were super, super high if he came out. But on the other hand, it also meant suffering mentally every single day, not being able to live a life as himself and to constantly have to push down and hide who he was to others. He never got to live a life that felt like his. And so not only was he putting on a performance in all of his roles, he was putting on a performance in his own life. In every moment of his life, he was forced to be on stage and never live a life that was actually his own. But I've kind of framed this whole discussion around Elliot because he was a public figure, and certainly the stakes are very clear in that world where someone's known to the world as a certain thing, and sort of your career is sort of based off of you being visually seen in a certain way. But it's just a situation that actually throws into stark relief the reality that pretty much every single LGBTQ person has to face in one way or another. For myself, for example, I reached a point in my life around the age of 21 where I was honestly deeply depressed and angry at myself for not being able to come out. I remember around that time, I was close to graduating college, and I would drive down to the local Targets and Walmarts and Salvation Armies in my town, at least once a week, and just kind of walk around the periphery of the women's clothing section, just begging myself, just wishing myself to just go and try on a dress, just like go into the change room and just try one on. I mean, what's the harm? It wasn't going to hurt anyone. No one's going to know. And I didn't even have the courage to do that. I couldn't even have the courage to be myself in the privacy of a changing room. And then I would go back to my room and try to hide that I was crying and that I was feeling so depressed from my roommate. I had to put on that performance because at that point in my life, I was kind of thinking about how that if I knew that if I came out when I graduated from film school, which I'll be doing in, just a few short months or weeks, I might hurt my chances of having a career in film. This was one of the many factors, to be fair, that I was sort of weighing. I didn't want to lose my friends. I didn't want to not be accepted, but it was one of the ones that was definitely high on my priority list, especially at a young age. I desperately wanted to work in video and film, and I knew that being transgender or being seen as transgender at that time had a great chance of hurting my career before it even began. That's the price that I had to weigh before I came out. I was forced to make this sort of choice in my head between a career and being a more consumable, marketable version of myself, and being able to achieve what I wanted to achieve and be able to pay my bills, or, living a life where I didn't hate myself at every single moment. And while I did eventually come out before I graduated college, it did prevent me from going to Los Angeles for a year for numerous other reasons, money and being able to transition and all that stuff. But it did put off me starting my career for a time. And while I can never know for sure, even after I moved to Los Angeles, who knows if there were opportunities that I missed out on because I was trans. I never hid the fact on my resume or when I talked to anybody that I was trans. And so, maybe there was opportunities that I didn't get because of that. Now, to be fair, I am lucky because I did get opportunities regardless of that, and sometimes because of that. But again, it's sort of a thing that we'll never know which way or the other. And to be honest, I am incredibly privileged in many ways. I mean, given my background, the income that my family had when I was younger, the fact that my family was accepting in many ways, and the fact that, Los Angeles and the film industry is generally, especially right now, more accepting of LGBTQ folks than many other industries are. So I was kind of lucky in that respect. But many transgender and other LGBTQ folks are even in more precarious positions where they'll maybe live in states without without protections against LGBTQ discrimination in jobs, of which there are currently 27 states that don't have express protections for LGBTQ discriminations, or countries outside of the U.S. that don't have those things as well, or maybe they live in industries that are much more less friendly to LGBTQ folks in general. These LGBTQ folks are placed in this choice where it isn't just between coming out and being able to pursue a career you love, but between coming out and being able to survive, to pay even your basic bills, paying your rent, to not being homeless. And all of this still happens, especially to transgender folks who are very, very stigmatized within the United States. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 1 in 4 transgender people in the United States have lost a job due to being trans. 3/4 of trans people have experienced some level of workplace discrimination for being trans, such as being passed over for a promotion. I won't talk about the specifics of my situation, but that has happened to me. Not the promotion aspect, but I have been discriminated against in the workplace for being trans. Now, again, I won't talk about which place that happened to and when that happened, just protect some people involved in that, but I have experienced that. And, 1 in 8 transgender people are forced into underground economies like sex or drug work just to survive because they aren't able to get jobs because they are trans. And all of these rates, by the way, are even higher for transgender people of color. And by the way, I should make clear, I'm not judging sex work or drug usage, by the way, but many transgender folks are forced into those situations because they're trans, because they aren't consumable, because they aren't seen as an identity that's worth employing or thinking about or caring about. Because while certainly things like shame, stigmatization, overt transphobia and homophobia and discrimination and fear of never finding a loved one, for example, all contribute to transgender folks not coming out, I think the overriding theme of all of that, and I think one of major reasons that stops people from coming out, is this idea of your identity being more marketable and consumable if you aren't seen as LGBTQ. And that plays a large role in many people's decisions to not come out. I think that's sort of an overriding theme of all of those things, it's going to be harder to find a partner because you're trans, because you're not seen as more desirable. We see that with the super straight movement today. Same thing with jobs. You're not able to get hired as well because you're trans, and that might cause people to have overt discrimination against you, or even implicit or unintentional discrimination against you because you're trans. We see that in sort of many studies that have shown that people are more likely to hire people that look like themselves, that share the same identity as themselves, and because less trans people are hired in general, this sort of perpetuates that economy of trans people not getting hired. Again, that's sort of an implicit thing. It's not an explicit thing that people do intentionally, but it does happen. But because many LGBTQ folks, many of us know that our identities aren't as accepted, that can hurt our ability to pay our bills, because we sadly live in a society that requires us to think about how we present ourselves in the best possible light in order to be employed, in order to find work, in order to make products, and so we make ourselves a product in a way, instead of just being able to live our lives in a way that makes us mentally healthy and happy. We focus more on what we can, give back to the world, what we can, produce, rather than what we do to care for ourselves and live a life that feels worth living. And while we are getting to a place where some transgender people can come out and still have thriving careers like Elliot Page is doing right now, and I'm so glad for that, even in those situations, the coming out has to be tailored and catered in a way to make us palatable. Elliot Page himself provides a good example of that. I'm sure the choice to come out when he did was a mix of, measuring against his own struggles with mental health and wanting to continue to keep his career. I'm sure he thought carefully about how and when he had to come out. It probably wasn't just a spur of the moment thing that he did on a Wednesday. It's evidenced by the fact that he had a statement ready. This isn't a judgment on him at all. I understand why he did it that way, but it just shows how carefully he had to move to be able to keep his career at the expense of his mental health. I'm sure he wanted to come out he talks about in the article, he wanted to come out years and years and years earlier, and he had to wait until this moment in time for him to be able to come out. And even then, there was a chance that he could have lost his career. It's why the statement by the Umbrella Academy producers after he came out saying that they're going to keep employing him was incredibly meaningful. And it's really awful that he has to think about that, how marketability of identity forces people to have to hide who they are. And his career is lucky, perhaps only to still be able to thrive because of his careful maneuvering and his building of his career before coming out, again, at the expense of his emotional well-being for many years. But it's also worth mentioning that, as Elliot does in the article, that even despite that, he still faced a ton of transphobia and hatred online for coming out. He still faces transphobia today, even though his career, seems like it's going to still be successful. And who knows, maybe even down the line, he may lose out on roles. His career may not have thrived as much as it would have had he not come out. That's a game that we'll never be able to know the answer to, but it is a possible hypothetical scenario. It's a game we shouldn't have to play, but we kind of do. In a way, I play it in many ways too. Like, what if I had come out earlier? What if I had never come out at all? Would my career be better? Would it be worse? I don't know. But it's one I think about often. But I also don't want to completely end in a negative here, because I also think that while this is a horrible thing, and it's a horrible sort of place to be in, where LGBTQ folks have to suffer because of this marketplace of identity, but because it's in many ways nothing new to us, it's also allowed us to think in terms that are more helpful, allowing us to learn more about our community and help others learn more about our community. Again, it's a situation that I think is horrible, but LGBTQ folks have often made best use of it to maneuver this sort of marketability of identity in order to create chances for learning and growth on, society as a whole. I think to use a kind of recent example that's still kind of in my mind personally, I think of Abigail Thorne of Philosophy Tube, who recently came out as transgender. And in her video where she came out, she said that considering that she was going to be one of the most visible transgender people in the United Kingdom, she, quote, wanted to get transgender right.
Because of my existing following, I have now instantly become one of the most recognizable trans people in the country, and I feel an enormous pressure to be good at it. Like, if I could only be clever enough, or pretty enough, or funny, or articulate enough, then things would magically come right. Alas.
There's no right or wrong way to be trans, and yet we understand kind of implicitly when we come out that there's a way to maneuver your coming out in order to do the most good. This sort of understanding about how to market your identity in a way that can be beneficial to society. Again, it's kind of horrible, but there's sort of that implicit sort of understanding being sort of put forth in her words. I hate the fact that she felt that she had to hide her identity from the public in order to be more consumable in her videos for a long time. But when she came out, she used that chance to draw attention to other transgender issues, like Elliot Page did in his Time magazine article. Abigail's video sort of mentions a slew of things happening in the United Kingdom when it comes to transgender folks, just as Elliot's article talks a lot about similar stuff happening in the United States.
But I can relay the following facts. Trans people have existed for as long as there has been a Britain. Longer. But even after a century of feminism, the government still dictates what we can do with our own bodies.
Again, I don't think that Elliot or Abigail or any transgender person should have to use their coming out to center larger issues, but I think it speaks to how keenly aware LGBTQ folks are of how our identities are viewed because of the performances that we are forced to play in our every single daily lives, even regardless, that many of us use our coming out, or at least if we're public figures, to have a chance to have a larger conversation and help the larger LGBTQ community. And it's also worth mentioning, by the way, that while I've been speaking about myself in this video and Elliot and Abigail, because they're current zeitgeisty examples, this is something that transgender people of color have been doing for a long time, even before now. I think of, for example, actress Laverne Cox or YouTubers like Kat Black, who have been using their platforms to speak on transgender issues for years. And they were also far from the first. I also think of Marsha P. Johnson, for example. So ultimately, though, yes, this did become a bit of a leftist rant about how our identities in a capitalist society are always being talked about how we are consumable or marketable, and about how all LGBTQ folks, but especially the most vulnerable within our community, like transgender people in general, or transgender people living in areas of the world where they are less accepted, and especially transgender people of color really anywhere, how they're forced to choose between their true selves and helping their mental health, or being able to be seen by the world as someone who is capable of being employed or worth caring about, or is more consumable in many ways. And the harmful and desperate catch-22 that places us into. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I also think of those like Elliot Page, who when they are lucky and privileged enough to do so, how they take and use it to try to help others. It's not perfect, it shouldn't be necessary, but it also speaks to this sense of larger community that I think defines the LGBTQ community in such a beautiful way. Alrighty, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and speaking of marketable and consumable identities, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Look at me transitioning. There's another pun there. I didn't even intend that one. Oh, look at, I'm just mastering the YouTubes up in here. Anyways, now that I've ruined everything, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I would also love to hear all of your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to have a conversation about this. I'd love to have a conversation about what resonated with you. If you want to talk about that with Elliot's coming out, or just saying how awesome Elliot is, we can have all that conversation down below. I also have a Patreon page where you can help support me doing what I do. But beyond that, I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Patrons, it is time to assemble! Catherine Lambeth, Miranda Janelle, Ashley Allen, Bokikio, Eli Bergmas, Ashlyn Solstice, John Cool, Greg Gillum, Stephen Kleinard, Chamomile T, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, Boyd Earl, and Marybeth Earl, Stephen Schuhart, Wayne Twitchell, Auntie Kate, 808, Rick Osborne, Dominic Noble, Ish the Mad, Buttoneer, John Steele, Meadow Whisperer, Gavin Robinson, Michael Beam, Munir Amlani, BBD, Jason Knott, Hannah F, Andrew K, Bree Beecher, Jasmine, Sky Skinner, Maeve, Skylar Gray, Flynn Nathan Steele, Tiffany Danger, Sean Piper, Geek Filter, Jane Packard, Wen Dizzle Bizzle. Why do I do this to myself? Sarah Bystem, James Karate, Jacob Tovar, W. Randy, Edie, Mari Neckar, Bush, Celestial Dawn, Din, Mark the Edge, Pissed and Twisted Garage, Lily, Polly Mina, Laura Demo, Lisa, Nikki Gordon, Bloomfield, Andrew, Lamaro, Zone 1 Librarian, Jenny Mabel, Michael Hardy, and finally, Corey Honkanen and Vale. Done. Alright, not my best patron rap, but I figured it would still be fun for you to see all my failure on screen, immortalized in every video this month. Also, I know I mixed Captain America and Superwoman. Deal with it. But thank you, honestly, to all my patrons. I really appreciate all of you, and you really mean a lot to me. I would not be able to do this without you. Thank you so much for supporting me being an absolute dork and weirdo. I wish you all the best.